New York City, January 1976. Every morning, a yellow cab idles near East 67th Street, just steps from the Soviet mission to the United Nations. Its driver talks too much, knows every shortcut, and never seems to stop smiling. His name is Jimmy Rossi. At least, that's what his license says. But Jimmy Rossi doesn't exist. For 21 months, this cab becomes a moving surveillance platform, logging times, routes, conversations, and secrets. One Soviet diplomat climbs into the back seat again and again, believing he's invisible in plain sight. He's wrong. This is Operation Friendly Fare. James Patterson was born in Brooklyn in 1942. His father worked the city's transit system for 38 years and taught his son two essential skills before anything else: how to read a city's rhythms and how to read the people moving through it. By age 22, Patterson spoke conversational Russian and had developed what his initial CIA evaluators called an unusual capacity for sustained performance under observation. The defining moment came during his first overseas posting in early 1973. Patterson was running surveillance on a suspected KGB officer operating under commercial cover in Vienna. The target had been photographed, his movements logged, his associates mapped. The operation was textbook until the final approach. Patterson positioned himself at an adjacent cafe table. He ordered correctly. His newspaper was appropriately local. But when he glanced up at precisely the wrong moment, the target's expression changed. Not alarm, recognition, not of Patterson's face, but of his presence as something artificial in the environment. The target walked away. The operation collapsed. Patterson spent 6 weeks analyzing what went wrong. The conclusion wasn't technical, it was behavioral. The target hadn't seen through the cover because of what Patterson did. He saw through it because of what Patterson was. Too careful, too controlled, too aware of being watched. Successful intelligence work, Patterson realized, wasn't about becoming invisible. It was about becoming believable. The difference was everything. By 1975, Patterson had developed a reputation within the CIA's Soviet Russia division. He was fluent in Russian tradecraft doctrine, but more valuable for something harder to teach: the ability to project authenticity without calculation. He could discuss baseball statistics with genuine enthusiasm. He knew which delis made the best pastrami and could recommend them without hesitation. People felt smarter, funnier, more interesting when talking to him. His defining capability distilled to one sentence: he made people forget to be cautious. This skill became operationally significant when the Soviet Russia division faced a growing intelligence gap in early 1975. KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover in Manhattan had become increasingly difficult to monitor using conventional methods. Fixed surveillance teams were identified and avoided. Electronic coverage inside diplomatic vehicles was impossible due to detection equipment. Human sources inside the Soviet mission were either compromised or non-existent. The intelligence community could track where Soviet operatives went, but not what they said, thought, or planned while moving through the city. The problem intensified throughout the summer of 1975. Counterintelligence analysts noted pattern changes, suggesting active measures were being coordinated through New York rather than Washington. But without access to unguarded conversations, assessments remained speculative. Patterson became the solution not because he could follow Soviet operatives more effectively, but because he could get them to invite him into their daily routines without triggering any defensive awareness. The doctrine driving Operation Friendly Fare was straightforward: access beats surveillance. This principle had governed human intelligence collection since the Second World War, but its application in urban environments against trained counterintelligence officers required adapting to modern realities. Soviet diplomatic personnel were trained to assume constant FBI surveillance. They expected cars following them, apartments wired, colleagues potentially compromised. What they didn't expect was threat from genuinely mundane infrastructure. The CIA called this behavioral penetration. The logic was simple. Embed an asset so ordinary, so consistent with the target's environmental expectations, that no defensive instinct activates. Taxi drivers were ideal candidates. They were transient by nature. They overheard conversations without appearing to listen. They existed in a social category that made them functionally invisible to passengers discussing sensitive matters. The obstacles were equally clear. First, maintaining deep cover under constant, repeated contact without exposure required psychological discipline rarely sustained beyond weeks. Second, reporting. Intelligence without creating detectable patterns meant accepting severe communication restrictions. Third, avoiding emotional drift. The documented phenomenon where operatives begin identifying with their cover identity more than their actual role had ended previous long-duration urban operations. Despite these challenges, planners identified an opportunity in December 1975. Counterintelligence had flagged one Soviet officer whose movements were unusually cultural and unusually consistent. Aleksei Kuznetsov, officially listed as a junior consular officer at the Soviet mission, visited bookstores, attended theater performances, and traveled to locations suggesting personal interest rather than operational necessity. His pattern was predictable. His routes were repeatable. Most critically, he appeared to treat New York as a city to experience rather than an operational environment to navigate cautiously. The assessment was that Kuznetsov represented either a genuine cultural enthusiast or someone using cultural activities as cover for intelligence work. Either way, his predictability created a vulnerability. Authorization to proceed came in late December 1975. Within 6 weeks, all operational elements would be in position. But first, Patterson needed to stop being James Patterson entirely. During the preparation phase in early January 1976, Patterson experienced what CIA psychologists later documented as identity displacement anxiety. For 3 weeks, he lived exclusively as Jimmy Rossi, sleeping in the Queen's apartment, driving the routes, eating at the diners, speaking with the accent. The training wasn't about memorizing details. It was about erasing the pause between question and answer. The micro-hesitation that signals performance rather than reality. In one session, a role player posing as a passenger asked about Patterson's family. Patterson hesitated for 1.3 seconds before answering. The session was stopped. The psychologist made a note. Subject still accessing constructed biography rather than inhabiting it. The training continued for 4 more days until Patterson could discuss his fictional sister's fictional children with the automatic fluidity of actual memory. In the post-training assessment, evaluators noted that Patterson had developed what they termed dangerous fluency. The cover identity was becoming neurologically indistinguishable from authentic memory. The risk was documented. The operation proceeded. Intercepted communications from February 1976 revealed Kuznetsov discussing his daughter's violin recital with his wife. Analysts noted nothing operationally relevant. The girl was 8 years old. She was struggling with a Vivaldi piece. Kuznetsov sounded tired and proud simultaneously. When the operation reached its conclusion 21 months later, that daughter would return to Moscow, never understanding why her father seemed different, quieter, more careful about whom he trusted. By January 19, 1976, the operation entered its execution phase. Patterson received final authorization at 0900 hours. The window was indefinite, contingent on maintaining access without detection. There was no planned end date. The operation would continue until Kuznetsov was recalled, Patterson was compromised, or strategic objectives were achieved. James Patterson became Jimmy Rossi at 0630 hours on January 20th, 1976. The transformation was supported by infrastructure built over 6 weeks. The New York Taxi and Limousine Commission records showed medallion number 4, Q17, had been registered to James Rossellini in 1968, transferred to his son James Jr. in 1974, and now operated under the street name Jimmy Rossi. The paperwork included parking violations dating back 18 months. The Queens apartment at 41st Avenue had utility bills in Rossi's name going back 7 months. Union records showed sporadic attendance at meetings. 3 different diner waitresses could describe his usual order. The taxi itself was a 1974 Chevrolet Impala, modified with a concealed floor compartment beneath the driver's seat. The compartment held a microcassette recorder, model Sony TC-110A, rated for 8 continuous hours of recording. The activation switch was integrated into the meter reset button, requiring a specific double press pattern to engage. The recorder could be retrieved and replaced at designated service intervals without dismounting any visible components. Communication protocols were analog by design. Patterson maintained handwritten route logs documenting every fare, pickup location, destination, time, fare amount, and a coded notation system indicating whether passengers spoke Russian, made phone calls, or discussed anything requiring follow-up analysis. These logs were dropped every 72 hours at a dry cleaner on 10th Avenue between 44th and 45th Streets. The owner, a retired Army Signals, ICE intelligence specialist, passed them to a case officer handler during routine pickup of actual dry cleaning. No radios, no signals, no digital traces. The operational team was intentionally minimal. One case officer handler managed Patterson's reporting and psychological monitoring. One technical support contact maintained the recording equipment and handled any mechanical issues with the taxi. Patterson operated alone on the street. Compartmentalization ensured that if any element was compromised, the others remained protected. Pattern avoidance was enforced with obsessive precision. Patterson varied his shifts, his routes between fares, his lunch locations, and his parking spots. He accepted fares to all 5 boroughs. He complained about traffic authentically because he experienced it genuinely. The greatest operational risk wasn't discovery, it was routine. Every ride had to feel completely real, because for Jimmy Rossi, it was real. By the 3rd week of February, Jimmy Rossi had become a known presence near the Soviet mission. He didn't hover. He didn't solicit fares aggressively. He simply appeared in the taxi queue at times when diplomatic personnel needed transportation. Other drivers recognized him. Doormen knew his cab. He was part of the neighborhood's operational background. First contact occurred on February 9th, 1976, at 0940 hours. Aleksei Kuznetsov exited the Soviet mission and approached the taxi stand. 3 cabs were available. Kuznetsov chose the second one, Patterson's. The destination was the Strand Bookstore on Broadway. Patterson took a longer route, not dramatically longer, but enough to add 6 minutes of conversation time. The detour was justified by construction on the direct route, visible and verifiable. Patterson filled the silence the way cab drivers fill silence, with harmless noise about subway delays, a Yankees exhibition game, and a joke about tourists blocking traffic in Times Square. Kuznetsov laughed. Not politely, genuinely. That was the operational opening Patterson had been trained to create. The laugh meant Kuznetsov had categorized Jimmy Rossi as harmless, authentic, and forgettable. It meant the defensive walls trained into every KGB officer had not activated. The ride lasted 18 minutes. Kuznetsov paid, added a modest tip, and walked into the bookstore without looking back. Patterson logged the fare, noted the absence of any operational conversation, and continued his shift. The recorder had captured nothing of intelligence value. The operation was working exactly as designed. Complications emerged within 3 weeks. Kuznetsov requested Patterson specifically for 3 rides between February 23rd and March 2nd. This violated the randomness principle essential to maintaining natural cover. Surveillance units reported that other KGB officers were using different taxi services, suggesting some internal protocol about transportation diversity. Patterson needed to limit his availability to Kuznetsov without seeming evasive or unavailable. The solution was operational discipline disguised as economics. Patterson began working longer shifts, making him legitimately unavailable during certain hours. He took fares to distant locations that kept him out of the Soviet mission area for extended periods. When Kuznetsov requested him and he was available, Patterson accepted immediately. When he wasn't available, other drivers took the fare. The pattern appeared random because it was random, governed by the authentic chaos of taxi driver schedules. March through May established the operational rhythm. Kuznetsov used Patterson's cab approximately twice weekly, sometimes more, occasionally less. The conversations remained superficial. Weather, city politics, cultural events, sports. Patterson never asked personal questions. He never steered conversations toward Soviet policy or diplomatic matters. He simply responded naturally to whatever Kuznetsov initiated. The shift occurred in early June. Kuznetsov began treating the cab as a genuinely private space. He took phone calls while in transit, speaking Russian, assuming the driver understood nothing. He named destinations before deciding whether to go, thinking aloud about schedule conflicts. He complained about colleagues, about bureaucratic absurdities, about missing Moscow while simultaneously enjoying New York's freedoms. Patterson never reacted. He drove. He navigated traffic. He offered opinions about restaurants and shortcuts. The recorder captured everything. Intelligence analysts reviewing the tapes identified 3 significant revelations by mid-June. First, Kuznetsov referenced a colleague by first name and patronymic, Dmitry Petrovich, suggesting familiarity inconsistent with official organizational charts. Second, he complained about report deadlines that didn't align with known consular schedules. Third, he mentioned a meeting location in Brighton Beach that had no apparent diplomatic function. Each detail alone was minor. Together, they suggested Kuznetsov was involved in intelligence work beyond his official consular duties. The operation's value was increasing. By August 1976, Patterson had been operating continuously for 7 months. The psychological strain was documented in his monthly evaluation reports. He was sleeping in character, dreaming in character, responding to the name Jimmy even in secure debriefings. The case officer handler noted concerning signs. Patterson was beginning to resent interruptions to his taxi schedule for operational meetings. He expressed frustration about missing fares while in debriefings. He had opinions about which street corners yielded better tips. The assessment was clear. Legend drift was occurring. Patterson was becoming Jimmy Rossi in ways that transcended operational necessity. The risk was that he might prioritize maintaining cover over intelligence collection. Or worse, that he might lose the ability to distinguish between operational objectives and authentic life experience. A clinical psychologist specializing in deep cover operations interviewed Patterson in September. The psychologist asked Patterson to describe his sister. Patterson immediately discussed Maria Rossi, her 3 children, her husband's plumbing business in Jersey City, and her concerns about the oldest boy's grades. The psychologist stopped him, asked again, "Describe your actual sister." Patterson paused for 4.7 seconds before remembering he was an only child. The assessment recommended either terminating the operation or implementing mandatory identity reinforcement protocols. Patterson refused termination. The protocols were implemented. Weekly sessions where Patterson spent 1 hour discussing his actual childhood, his actual family, his actual career with CIA. The sessions were uncomfortable. Patterson later reported they felt like betraying Jimmy Rossi. But the mission continued because the intelligence was now critically valuable. Kuznetsov had begun discussing operational matters with increasing specificity, apparently confident that his Russian conversations were incomprehensible to an American cab driver. He mentioned dead drop locations. He referenced agent code names. He complained about communication protocols that required excessive caution. By October 1976, CIA counterintelligence had identified 2 previously unknown KGB handlers operating in New York and had mapped portions of a network supporting illegal agents, Soviet intelligence officers operating without diplomatic protection under deep cover in American society. The operation was producing intelligence that justified its risks. Winter brought operational challenges. Kuznetsov traveled less frequently during heavy snow. When he did travel, conversations were shorter, focused on immediate navigation rather than casual discussion. Patterson maintained presence, accepted other fares, and avoided any behavior suggesting dependency on Kuznetsov's business. The breakthrough came not from planning, but from accident. On March 14, 1977, Patterson's taxi broke down with Kuznetsov in the back seat. A genuine mechanical failure, not staged. Patterson's reaction was authentic frustration. He needed the fare, needed the cab operational, needed to maintain his schedule. He apologized profusely, called for another taxi to complete Kuznetsov's trip, refused payment since the ride was incomplete. Kuznetsov insisted on paying anyway. More significantly, he asked when Patterson would be back in service and suggested he'd prefer to wait rather than use another driver. The incident transformed their relationship from driver and passenger to something resembling routine preference. Kuznetsov now actively sought Patterson's cab rather than accepting it as convenient option. This created new operational possibilities. Patterson could suggest routes, could mention seeing Kuznetsov at locations during previous fares, could establish the fiction that he paid attention to regular customers. The boundary between surveillance and relationship was dissolving exactly as Patterson had been trained to accomplish. From April through December 1977, the intelligence yield increased exponentially. Kuznetsov discussed meeting times with enough specificity that FBI surveillance could position assets in advance. He mentioned colleague names that allowed counterintelligence to identify previously unknown intelligence officers. He complained about a superior, Grigory Alexandrovich, whose excessive caution was interfering with operational efficiency. Each piece of information was individually minor, but collectively devastating to Soviet intelligence security. The CIA was building a comprehensive map of KGB personnel, methods, and priorities in New York, without needing to recruit a single source or execute a single technical penetration. The psychological cost to Patterson was severe and worsening. His January 1978 evaluation noted he had begun correcting people who called him James. He expressed anger when debriefing sessions conflicted with what he called his real work. He had developed opinions about fare prices, traffic patterns, and customer tipping behavior that reflected genuine emotional investment rather than cover maintenance. The handler asked Patterson directly, "Do you understand you're a CIA officer?" Patterson responded, "Of course," then added, "But Jimmy Rossi has bills to pay." The distinction was collapsing. The operation reached its critical moment on June 12, 1978, at 19:18 hours. Pickup location was East 72nd Street near 2nd Avenue. Destination was a Broadway theater for a 2100 hours performance. Patterson knew Kuznetsov well enough by this point to predict he'd arrive 45 minutes early and walk the neighborhood before entering. Traffic stalled on 6th Avenue between 50th and 51st Streets. Construction barriers forced a detour. Kuznetsov complained about city planning, about bureaucratic incompetence, about Americans having resources but no organization. Patterson agreed casually, mentioned he'd heard about a Russian play opening next month, mispronounced the title slightly wrong. Kuznetsov corrected him automatically, then stopped. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Patterson glanced in the rearview mirror and spoke one sentence, rehearsed for months but delivered a spontaneous observation. Funny how Aleksei Kuznetsov always prefers aisle seats. The silence extended. 90 seconds. Patterson didn't break, didn't turn, didn't change expression, just drove. The vulnerability Patterson was exploiting wasn't fear of arrest. It was isolation. Kuznetsov understood immediately that someone knew his full name, knew his patterns, knew details that suggested comprehensive surveillance. The FBI could end his career, destroy his family's future, or worse. Cooperation meant survival. Resistance meant destruction. The ride continued. Patterson drove to the theater, accepted payment, said nothing else. Kuznetsov exited the cab and stood on the sidewalk for 23 seconds before walking toward the theater entrance. The operation had just shifted from surveillance to recruitment. Over the following 6 weeks, Kuznetsov and Patterson established an understanding without ever explicitly discussing it. Kuznetsov continued using Patterson's cab. Patterson continued being Jimmy Rossi. But now, Kuznetsov deliberately discussed operational matters, knowing they were being recorded, choosing what information to provide and what to protect. The intelligence assessments from this period noted an interesting pattern. Kuznetsov provided accurate information about lower-level operations and personnel, valuable intelligence, but nothing that would directly endanger himself. He protected information about senior KGB officials and long-term strategic operations. He was cooperating enough to ensure his safety while maintaining enough loyalty to avoid feeling like a complete traitor. Patterson never pushed, never asked questions, never suggested Kuznetsov provide more. The arrangement worked because both men understood the boundaries without stating them. The extraction came in October 1978. Kuznetsov was quietly recalled to Moscow. His personnel file marked administrative reassignment. No public accusations, no diplomatic incident. He returned to a mid-level position in the foreign ministry, his career intact, but his operational utility to KGB eliminated. The CIA assessment was that Moscow suspected Kuznetsov had been compromised, but lacked proof sufficient to justify harsher measures. The recall was face-saving for all parties. Kuznetsov kept his life and his position. Soviet intelligence removed a security liability. American intelligence preserved a successful operations methodology for future use. The official investigation never produced public findings. The FBI was aware that some form of successful intelligence operation had targeted Soviet personnel in New York during the mid to late 70s. But the specifics remained classified at levels preventing even routine counterintelligence sharing. Evidence was deliberately minimal by design. Patterson's taxi logs were destroyed on a rolling 72-hour schedule. The recordings were transcribed and the originals erased. No physical trace of Operation Friendly Fare existed outside secure CIA facilities. The Soviet Union issued no formal protests because acknowledging the operation would require admitting their personnel had been successfully penetrated. Internal KGB assessments, later revealed after the Soviet collapse, indicated they suspected American intelligence had achieved some form of access to Kuznetsov, but never determined the specific method. Their countermeasure was simply rotating personnel more frequently and reinforcing warnings about discussing operational matters in any semi-public space. The denials and silence were transparent to those in the intelligence community. But transparency wasn't the point. Both sides understood the operation had occurred. Both sides chose not to escalate it into broader conflict. The operational achievement was significant across multiple dimensions. Tactically, the CIA had acquired comprehensive mapping of KGB personnel and operations in New York without the risks associated with technical penetration or human recruitment. 2 previously unknown handlers were identified and subsequently monitored, leading to the identification of 3 illegals operating under American identities. The intelligence enabled FBI counterintelligence to disrupt several operations without revealing the source of their knowledge. Strategically, Operation Friendly Fare demonstrated that modern counterintelligence could still succeed through patient, psychologically sophisticated human operations rather than relying exclusively on technical collection. The operations methodology was studied, documented, and adapted for use in other urban environments. Elements of the taxi driver cover were attempted in London, Paris, and Vienna, with varying degrees of success. The diplomatic cost was essentially non-existent. Relations with the Soviet Union continued their normal Cold War pattern of tension and negotiation. The operation was small enough and quiet enough to avoid triggering the cycles of expulsion and retaliation that characterized more visible intelligence confrontations. The operational cost was primarily human. For Patterson, the consequences were severe and permanent. He left fieldwork in March of 1979, officially citing routine career progression. The actual reason was documented in classified psychological evaluations. Patterson had developed what clinicians termed identity fragmentation, the inability to maintain consistent self-concept across contexts. For Hans Aleksei would respond to different names depending on environment. His speech patterns shifted unconsciously. He reported feeling more authentic when performing a role than when attempting to be himself. The condition was manageable with treatment, but incompatible with continued intelligence work. Patterson transferred to analytical positions where his understanding of Russian operations was valuable, but his psychological state was less critical. He retired from CIA in 1991. According to partially declassified medical records, he struggled with what he called silence. After years of constant performance and conversation, he found genuine privacy and solitude psychologically uncomfortable. The unintended consequence that reshaped doctrine was philosophical. Operation Friendly Fare proved that intelligence work in the modern era still hinged on fundamental human vulnerabilities. The need for normalcy, the desire for routine, the comfort of familiar faces. Technology could enhance collection and analysis, but access still required human connection. The lesson was documented in revised training protocols emphasizing psychological preparation for deep cover operations and recognition of identity drift as operational hazard rather than personal failure. The moral calculation remains contested. From one analytical perspective, The operation was elegant and proportionate. No violence occurred. No coercion was employed beyond the implicit threat of exposure that governs all intelligence work. Kuznetsov was never tortured, never imprisoned, never physically harmed. He returned to Moscow alive and employed. The deception was limited to identity rather than intent. Patterson genuinely provided taxi service while simultaneously collecting intelligence. From an alternative perspective, the operation constituted intimate betrayal, built on manufactured trust and systematic psychological exploitation. Patterson created a relationship that felt authentic to Kuznetsov, the friendly cab driver who knew his preferences, remembered his comments, provided reliable service. That relationship was entirely false, designed from inception to extract information and ultimately coerce cooperation. The absence of physical violence doesn't eliminate the violation of trust that made the operation possible. The question extends beyond Kuznetsov and Patterson to the nature of intelligence work itself. If deception prevents greater harm, if mapping KGB networks protects American security and potentially saves lives, is systematic manipulation justified even when it destroys the human connection it depends on? Does the answer change if the target is genuinely engaged in espionage versus being an ordinary diplomat? Does it matter that Kuznetsov chose to cooperate rather than face exposure? Or does that choice become meaningless when manufactured by comprehensive surveillance and psychological pressure? These questions have no definitive answers. They reveal more about individual moral frameworks than about the operation itself. Those who prioritize national security and strategic necessity will see Operation Friendly Fare as successful intelligence work that achieved important objectives through patience and skill. Those who prioritize individual autonomy and relational honesty will see it as sophisticated violation that sacrificed human dignity for tactical advantage. The operation worked. The intelligence was valuable. The costs were real. Whether those costs were justified depends entirely on your assessment of what intelligence work is permitted to be. What's your take on whether Patterson's 21 months of sustained deception was justified by the intelligence he collected? Does the fact that Kuznetsov was likely engaged in espionage himself change the moral calculation? Or does betrayal remain betrayal regardless of the target's own activities? Drop your perspective in the comments. If this story made you reconsider what intelligence work actually requires and what it costs the people who do it. Hit that like button and share it with someone who thinks espionage is just about gadgets and car chases. The human cost is always higher than the operational reports indicate.